Tonight, we slip quietly into a world where the most potent symbol of status wasn't a sword, a title, or even a perfectly waxed mustache, but a pineapple. Yes, a pineapple. That spiky golden fruit you might casually toss in a smoothie today. Well, in the 19th century, it could make or break your reputation at a party. You might not survive the social pressures of the Victorian elite, but don't worry. This journey requires 0 monocles, and it's mostly reclined. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Now, dim the lights, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You arrive at a grand Victorian soiree. Candlelight flickers across polished wood. The perfume of rosewater mingles with the whiff of cigar smoke. Conversation hums like a bee's nest, low, gossipy, a little over-perfumed. And then, you see him, striding through the crowd in full evening dress, waistcoat aglow, top hat balanced just so. He's holding a pineapple like it's the crown jewels. He doesn't offer it to anyone. No one dares touch it. The fruit perches in his white-gloved hand as though it descended directly from heaven. Why? Because in Victorian England, the pineapple wasn't food. It was a flex. Historians still argue whether this peculiar phenomenon began as early as the 17th century, or truly peaked in Queen Victoria's reign. But by the 1800s, the pineapple had become the object of conspicuous consumption, an edible that no one dared eat, lest the magic disappear. This all began with the sheer absurdity of growing the thing. Native to South America, pineapples struggled in England's climate. To coax one into ripening in a greenhouse, called a pinery, could take 2 years. That meant your average pineapple was less a fruit, more a minor miracle. No wonder people treated it with reverence, like an exotic trophy from far-off lands you'd probably never visit, but definitely wanted to name-drop. Picture yourself at a dinner party, seated beside Lady Featherstone, who lifts her lorgnette and peers at the centerpiece with practiced boredom. She murmurs. He brought that pineapple again. Yes, again. Many pineapples toured multiple events, their fame growing with each outing. It was like the red carpet circuit, but for fruit. There were rules, of course. You didn't serve the pineapple unless you were trying to show you had money, and reckless disregard for delayed gratification. To eat it was like driving your Rolls Royce into the sea to impress a date. Memorable, yes, but probably a touch excessive. And the symbolism ran deep. The pineapple represented empire, wealth, and global reach. To hold one was to suggest that you were a man of taste and colonial connections. Someone who could casually pluck this golden treasure from the tropics and carry it into a Mayfair drawing room like it was a fancy umbrella. You can almost feel the envy radiating off lesser guests as your pineapple gleams under the gaslight. It's not about the fruit, it's about the fantasy. Ironically, the Victorians didn't invent the pineapple obsession, they inherited it. Back in the 18th century, horticulturalists and aristocrats alike were obsessed with proving they could grow the impossible. The pineapple was their Everest, a fruit so difficult to cultivate that it became the horticultural equivalent of earning a doctorate in Instagram. A quirky tidbit? In some portraits from the Georgian era, a proud gentleman might pose beside a single pineapple, like he'd slain a dragon. These portraits were commissioned specifically to commemorate a successful harvest of one fruit. But as the pineapple slipped into the Victorian era, its symbolism shifted slightly. It wasn't just about horticultural triumph anymore. It became a theatrical prop in the elaborate pantomime of upper-class life. And here you are, gliding from conversation to conversation, pineapple in hand, nodding sagely at someone's comment about the price of East Indian spices. A server offers you a canapé. You decline, not because you're not hungry, but because you need to keep the hand free, the one that holds the pineapple. Behind your back, someone mutters about fruit flaunting. Ahead of you, a woman in lavender silk eyes your pineapple like it's a marriage proposal. You resist the urge to bow and whisper, "It's not for sale." It's ridiculous, of course, but also completely in character for the age. Victorian society ran on quiet competitions. Who had the highest lace collar, the most unread books on their shelves, the freshest servant gossip? And now, the ripest pineapple. What's more ridiculous? Some pineapples, once they'd finished their public rounds, were stuffed and lacquered so they could be displayed permanently, like a taxidermied deer. But fruit, in hindsight, it's all a bit silly. But in the flickering candlelight of a Victorian salon, with gossip swirling and champagne fizzing, you begin to understand the strange allure of holding something so rare, so absurd, and so absolutely unnecessary. You slip out of the ballroom for some air, the pineapple still securely cradled in one hand like a sacred relic. As you step onto the veranda, it dawns on you. No one ever questioned why someone was holding a pineapple. The act had become so normalized among the upper crust that it passed without remark, much like a monocle or a particularly pretentious walking cane. But you want to know more, don't you? Because there's something deliciously weird about this whole affair. Who decided that pineapples should be paraded around as fashion statements? The truth is tangled in layers of social aspiration, tropical obsession, and a pinch of imperial flair. Let's rewind. The pineapple first arrived in Europe in the 1490s, brought back by explorers like Columbus. It caused a stir, not just for its alien appearance and sugary flesh, but for what it represented. Here was a fruit so exotic, so far removed from Europe's chilly orchards, that it seemed touched by divinity. The native Tupi word for pineapple meant excellent fruit, and European colonists ran with it, though they were a little less poetic and more possessive. Still, it wasn't until the 1600s that Europe began attempting to grow pineapples themselves, and England in particular went absolutely bananas for them. Or, well, pineapples. Wealthy landowners started building heated greenhouses, pineries, designed to mimic the tropical warmth of pineapple homelands. These were expensive, delicate structures, and maintaining one was a year-round commitment. It was basically like adopting a very demanding, non-verbal child that smelled faintly of sugar. This gave rise to an entirely new status game. Not only could you afford imported pineapples, but you could grow your own. The ultimate flex. The original farm-to-table, except more like greenhouse to gala. And if you couldn't grow one, no problem. You could rent one. Yes, really. In Georgian and Victorian London, entire businesses existed for the sole purpose of renting pineapples to the less agriculturally fortunate. You'd pay a hefty fee to have a pineapple at your dinner party. The catch? You had to give it back, uneaten, when the night was over. It's the 19th century version of renting a limo for prom. Ridiculous, extravagant, and deeply important to your social clout. Historians still argue whether these rentals were more common among the middle class seeking upward mobility, or whether the upper crust used them just as much to sustain their reputations. But one thing's clear. Pineapples didn't just show up at parties. They starred in them. Inside the ball, the pineapple would be placed at the center of the dinner table, perhaps atop a mirrored pedestal surrounded by greenery and elaborate sugar sculptures. It wasn't dessert, it was the Beyoncé of the centerpiece. People would admire it, gossip about it, maybe even flirt in its shadow. And then it would disappear at the end of the evening, still pristine. Of course, some did eat their pineapples, but this was considered a little gauche unless it was your own fruit, grown from your pinery. Then, maybe, you could carve it up at the end of the night and serve it with cream and sugar. But even that was a risk. You'd spent years growing this thing. To slice into it was like opening a Fabergé egg to scoop out boiled yolk. Let's pause here for a quirky detail. Some Victorian hosts, especially those with theatrical flair, would insert cloves or gild the pineapple sleeves with gold paint before setting it out, just to really hammer home the point. This is not a fruit. This is art. This is me. And don't forget the portraits. If you were a gentleman of leisure and possessed a pineapple, however briefly, you might have it immortalized in oil. Imagine standing awkwardly for hours while your artist painstakingly captured the exact sheen of that fruit, which would probably begin to rot halfway through the sitting. Pineapples, ruining upholstery and impressing guests since the Enlightenment. You think back to the man at the party, the one who clutched his pineapple with quiet smugness. Was he the grower, the renter, a daring devourer? The mystery only adds to the allure. Maybe he inherited it. Maybe he stole it. Maybe it's just really well-preserved wax. In Victorian England, it was entirely plausible. And now here you are, leaning on a marble banister, looking at the London fog curling around the gas lamps, pineapple in hand, and wondering, who exactly are you trying to impress? Because here's the thing. Pineapples were never just about luxury. They were about longing. Longing for warmth, adventure, discovery. Longing for something beyond the coal-stained skies and rigid etiquette of English life. The Victorians were obsessed with order, with rules, with outward appearance. But beneath that veneer ran a current of wild curiosity. The pineapple, spiky, sweet, mysterious, was a symbol of that hidden hunger. Maybe you carry yours not just for status, but for the story it tells. A story of empires and ships, greenhouses and gossip, pride and produce. A story that continues quietly as the night wears on and your gloved hand grows tired. You step back into the ballroom just as the music changes tempo. Something softer now. A waltz, maybe, lulling guests into a kind of synchronized sway. You find yourself drifting too, not to the rhythm of the music, but to the rhythm of the conversation around you. Gossip in murmurs, laughter tucked behind fans. And here you are, pineapple still in hand. An honorary member of the Fruit Bearers Club. But let's be clear. Carrying a pineapple was never just a momentary fad. It belonged to an entire ecosystem of symbolism. In Victorian society, where speech was measured, gestures calculated, and class determined by how many forks you had at dinner, symbols mattered. A pineapple was a shorthand, a visual cue that said, "I've made it." Or at least, I fooled you into thinking I have. You might wonder, couldn't they have used something more practical, like a nice watch? Well, watches told time. Pineapples told stories. Take architecture, for instance. Wander through certain English estates or Scottish manors, and you'll find pineapples carved above doorways, woven into iron gates, even crowning garden gazebos. These weren't eccentric design choices. They were bold declarations. To display a pineapple, whether real or chiseled in stone, was to shout, "This house is worldly, rich, and just exotic enough to be fascinating." The most famous example? The Dunmore pineapple in Scotland. Yes, it's real. Built in 1761, it's a garden folly topped with an absurdly large stone pineapple rendered in painstaking detail. Historians still argue whether it was just a whimsical architectural joke or a sincere tribute to the fruit's symbolic weight. Either way, you can't help but chuckle. Imagining a nobleman pointing skyward and saying, "Behold my stone fruit." And it wasn't just buildings. Pineapples turned up on ceramics, wallpaper, furniture, jewellery, even chamber pots. Yes, you could relieve yourself into a porcelain pineapple if you had the budget and the imagination. Taste was subjective, status was not. Let's slip briefly into another room of the Victorian mind. Obsession with the exotic. This was the era of imperial expansion. After all, pineapples weren't just tasty trophies. They were products of faraway colonies. The British Empire stretched from the Caribbean to the Indian subcontinent, and each region brought with it a cargo hold of curiosities. Spices, silks, parrots, and yes, pineapples. Displaying one at a party said, "I have ties to the colonies. I might even own land there." It was both a personal brand and a subtle flex. No one had Instagram, but everyone had eyes. You overhear someone mention a pineapple luncheon at Lady Featherstone's last month. Apparently, she had not one, but 3 pineapples, each on its own mirrored stand. One was rumoured to be carved from beeswax, another flown in from Antigua, and the third, a Hamasit Varni, the scandal, the horror, the audacity of faux fruit. As you suppress a laugh, you realise something else. Pineapples weren't just social props. They were conversation starters, icebreakers. You didn't need wit if you had a pineapple. You could just hold it aloft and let others project their assumptions onto you. And that was the game. Victorian society ran on subtle performance. A flick of the wrist here, a half smile there. A pineapple cradled just so, each gesture loaded with unspoken meaning. You couldn't outright say, "I'm important," but you could let your fruit do the talking. Quirky tidbit time. In some circles, especially among upwardly mobile merchants, pineapples were placed outside businesses as signs of hospitality. They borrowed from the Caribbean tradition of using the fruit to welcome guests. And so, Victorian shops and inns started adopting the symbol too, often through carved signage or little pineapple-shaped lanterns. You'd walk into a haberdashery and see one above the door. Cozy, colonial, and ever so slightly ostentatious. Meanwhile, back at your party, the pianist hits a minor chord and conversation briefly dims. A guest walks by with a pineapple-shaped purse. Another one with a lapel pin shaped like the fruit's spiky crown. It's all around you. A surreal, delicious hallucination of stultus and starch collars. You wonder, how did we get here? How did one tropical fruit end up holding court in a London salon? It's worth noting that other fruits tried to claim the throne. Mangoes had a moment, so did bananas, but none matched the pineapple's peculiar cocktail of visual drama, imperial mystique, and logistical difficulty. Growing a mango was doable. Growing a pineapple was like taming a fire-breathing hedgehog. There's also this to consider. The pineapple looked designed. It was symmetrical, geometrically mesmerizing, covered in natural armor, crowned like a royal. If nature ever made an object to be revered, it was this. And of course, Victorian culture had a love affair with design. This was the era of William Morris, of wallpaper fetishes, of patterned excess. A pineapple fit right in, like a natural ornament masquerading as food. A passing server offers you punch, and you spot a tiny slice of pineapple bobbing in the glass. It's practically sacrilege, but also somehow fitting. Even diluted, diced, and floating in rum, the pineapple still manages to feel like a centerpiece. You take a sip and smile, because in this moment, pineapple in hand, you're not just a guest. You're a participant in a fruit-fueled theatre of class performance and colonial echoes. You've stepped into a story where status is prickly, sweet, and completely bananas. You drift further into the parlour, past a tapestry of birds in improbable colours and a grandfather clock ticking in polite disapproval. The pineapple is getting heavier in your hands. Or maybe you're just realizing how much weight it carries, metaphorically, because it's not just a fruit anymore. It's a resume. It's a CV wrapped in waxy green leaves and barbed skin. And so we come to a curious crossroads. The pineapple rental market. Yes, really. You see, not everyone could afford to buy a pineapple outright. Owning one was a multi-pound commitment, equivalent, in some cases, to an entire month's wages for a skilled labourer. But Victorian ingenuity and social anxiety found a workaround. Enter the fruit renting class. Across Britain, enterprising greengrocers and importers began offering pineapples for rent. For a modest fee, you could borrow a ripe, showy specimen for your dinner party, wedding, or social gathering. Just as you might rent a tuxedo or a string quartet, you could lease a fruit. The rules? Simple. Don't cut it. Don't bruise it. Definitely don't eat it. The pineapple wasn't there to be consumed. It was there to be seen, admired, and, if you were especially daring, briefly held for effect. Some grocers even kept a display rotation. A single pineapple might appear at 5 or 6 events before it was sold to someone who could finally afford to eat it. By then it was usually far too ripe. But hey, mold was a small price to pay for social credibility. Historians still argue whether this rental practice was widespread or more of a London phenomenon. Some say it was limited to urban elites with reputations to inflate. Others argue that it trickled down to the rising middle classes, desperate to climb the slippery pole of Victorian respectability. You tuck that little rental detail away, amuse at how status can cling to even the most perishable of goods. It's like renting clout by the hour. But let's pivot slightly, literally and metaphorically, and examine the pineapple as centerpiece. Because you're now seated at a long table, candlelit and shimmering with crystal and polished silver. The meal hasn't started, but already the centerpiece has everyone's attention. A towering silver epergne holding, you guessed it, a single pineapple at its peak. It sits there like a monarch among lesser fruits. Grapes, apples, maybe a fig or two sulking nearby. But all eyes are on the pineapple, because that's the point. Victorian dining was a competitive sport. Hostesses were judged not only on the quality of their roast beef, but on the opulence of their table decor. A pineapple told guests, I spared no expense, and also my grocer likes me best. Sometimes pineapples were surrounded by mirrors to catch the candlelight. Other times, they were gilded with gold leaf, not for taste, but for sparkle. You could even find glass domes designed specifically to display them. Little terrariums of opulence, as if the fruit were a rare orchid or the preserved skull of an extinct bird. Of course, none of this was meant to be touched. Eating the pineapple was taboo unless the host explicitly offered it. And even then, the first slice was ceremonial, cut with a flourish and shared with the most honored guest. You glance across the table and imagine the strategic maneuvering happening behind those polite smiles. Who will be offered the first bite? Who will pretend not to care, only to stare longingly at the fruit's golden flesh when no one's looking? Then again, not all pineapples were created equal. The truly elite, those with hot houses of their own, could grow them on English soil. These were called pineries, and maintaining one was a labor of obsessive devotion. The heating alone, using coal-fired flues or dung-powered fermentation pits, was a masterclass in thermodynamic stubbornness. The result? English-grown pineapples that could be bragged about for generations. You sip more punch and picture a nobleman in his greenhouse, gently misting his prize fruit like a newborn. His gardener, of course, does most of the work. But the credit? Oh, that belongs to him. Quirky aside. Some Victorian diaries mention pineapple thefts. Yes, thefts. An especially large or symmetrical specimen could tempt thieves who would sneak into hot houses or shipping crates and make off with the fruity loot. The resulting scandals made the local papers. Pineapple pilfered from Park Lane pantry. The alliteration practically wrote itself. And here's something stranger still. There were pineapple fakes. You sip more punch and picture a nobleman in his greenhouse, gently misting his prize fruit like a newborn. His gardener, of course, does most of the work. But the credit? Oh, that belongs to him. Quirky aside, some Victorian diaries mention pineapple thefts. Yes, thefts. An especially large or symmetrical specimen could tempt thieves who would sneak into hot houses or shipping crates and make off with the fruity loot. The resulting scandals made the local papers. Pineapple pilfered from Park Lane pantry. The alliteration practically wrote itself. And here's something stranger still. There were pineapple fakes. You heard that right. Some hosts, unable to afford the real thing, commissioned wax replicas. These were sculpted in detail, painted with naturalistic hues, and displayed under glass to hide the scentless truth. Guests might never know, unless of course they got too close. A faux pineapple was a risky gamble. If discovered, it could ruin a reputation, but if it passed, it granted temporary access to a higher social tier. Think of it as the fruit equivalent of buying followers. One curious artifact survives from the era. A wax pineapple, now housed in a museum in Bath. It's slightly lopsided, the paint chipped, but it tells a very human story. The story of someone who wanted, desperately, to be seen as refined, who placed a wax fruit among the silver and hoped no one would notice the difference. You glance at your own pineapple again, still real, still heavy, and still, somehow, absurd. Because here's the heart of it all. The pineapple was both a joke and a jewel, a ridiculous object taken very seriously. A foodstuff that was most of the time too valuable to eat. But perhaps that's the point. In a society obsessed with appearances, the pineapple was the ultimate paradox. Real but untouchable. Sweet but never tasted. A fruit-shaped mirror reflecting the strange, status-hungry soul of an entire age. The drawing room is growing warmer now. The velvet curtains drawn against the evening chill. The chandelier casting soft halos of gaslight overhead. You're still clutching that pineapple. More prop than produce at this point. And as the conversation around you shifts to gossip and theatre reviews, your mind wanders. Back to the gentleman who, in an act both absurd and entirely logical by Victorian standards, began carrying pineapples to parties. Yes, carried. Like accessories. Like handbags. Like a particularly spiky lapdog with nutritional value and zero loyalty. This peculiar practice reached its peak in the mid-1800s, when Victorian gentlemen, especially the younger set, eager to flirt with irony and status, would stroll into gatherings with a pineapple tucked under their arm. Not as a gift, not as a snack, as a statement. You imagine it now. A mustachioed lad in an exquisitely tailored waistcoat, his boots polished to a mirror shine, casually stepping out of a hansom cab, pineapple in tow. He might nod to the footman, adjust his cravat, and saunter into the ballroom as if nothing were amiss. Except, of course, for the exotic fruit cradled like a newborn against his chest. Some scholars argue this was a form of parody, an exaggerated display mocking the very social climbers who once rented these fruits by the hour. Others suggest it was genuine, a last gasp of earnest pineapple worship in a culture that had run out of new things to fetishize. Whatever the motivation, it caught on. For a brief window in history, pineapples became not just centerpieces or culinary marvels, but conversation starters, icebreakers, social talismans, and it worked. Picture it. You're at a crowded soiree, elbowing for space near the port decanter when a gentleman in a velvet smoking jacket glides by, pineapple perched confidently in hand. You can't not ask about it. And suddenly, you're talking. That's a genius. Because in a room full of war stories, opium dreams, and over-lacquered anecdotes about the Queen's cousin's pet pug, the man with the pineapple stood out. Not everyone was amused, of course. Old money found the habit a little too cheeky. A pineapple, after all, was supposed to be placed, not paraded. The nouveau riche, meanwhile, saw it as another way the upper crust flaunted their wealth, now in literal fruit form. But among artists, bohemians, and the dandy set, it became something close to art. Dandies, those walking works of aesthetic rebellion, adopted the pineapple as yet another ironic flourish, right alongside their pocket watches, silk gloves, and scented moustache wax. The fruit added an unpredictable twist. Some even had custom holders, leather slings, velvet pouches, or ornate cane attachments to cradle their produce of choice. Quirky tidbit? There's one caricature from the Punch satirical magazine showing a gentleman at the opera using his pineapple as an armrest. He looks terribly pleased with himself. The caption reads, "No need for applause when one's accessories do the clapping." What's more interesting is how this habit trickled down into other spaces. Gentlemen's clubs began to allow display fruit, a silent agreement that if your pineapple sat quietly on the side table, it was welcome. Theatres permitted them in box seats, as long as they didn't obstruct the view. And tailors? Well, they started altering suit patterns to better accommodate a pineapple-bearing stance. It all sounds absurd. And it was, but also oddly logical. Because pineapples had long symbolized welcome, luxury, and good taste. What better way to show you belong than to carry the very emblem of belonging? Still, not everyone managed the pineapple strut with grace. There are records, actual letters and journals, describing young men slipping on icy London streets, pineapples flying into traffic or crushed under carriage wheels. Others, slightly too tipsy, attempted to juggle them. One particularly memorable diary entry laments the loss of a promising specimen, flung aloft during a charade and dashed upon a candelabra. The drama. Historians still debate whether this trend was confined to London and its fashion-obsessed elite, or if it spread to other urban centres, Edinburgh, Bath, perhaps even colonial outposts like Calcutta or Kingston, where British officers might carry pineapples to balls as a tongue-in-cheek nod to the motherland. Interestingly, in certain artistic circles, the pineapple became a sort of pre-modern meme. Watercolours depict poets reclining with their fruits, and there's even a short-lived avant-garde theatre group known as the Order of the Spiked Fruit. They performed pantomimes in which the pineapple was a silent character, always present, never explained. No one remembers the scripts, but the fruit lives on. Now, if you're thinking, surely they didn't go everywhere with pineapples, I have bad news. One etiquette manual, Gainsborough's Guide to the Graces, 1861 edition, contains a footnote suggesting gentlemen not bring pineapples to funerals unless previously agreed upon with the family. Which means someone had to be told. Which means someone did it. You chuckle quietly at that. The image of a solemn mourner clutching a pineapple in grief is too ridiculous to resist. Still, it says something about the Victorian obsession with symbolism. Even grief had its props. Back in the party, you tighten your grip. You feel a little ridiculous, but also a little magnificent. You're not just a guest, you're a walking centerpiece. People glance over. They raise eyebrows. They smirk. One woman whispers behind her fan, then gives you a conspiratorial nod. And just like that, the pineapple has paid for itself. Your arm is starting to ache now. The pineapple heavier than it looks. But abandoning it mid-soiree would be unthinkable. It's more than fruit. It's your identity tonight. And as you settle deeper into a brocade armchair beside the fire, listening to someone recite a sonnet about Venetian gondoliers, you wonder how exactly did this fruit, this spiky tropical oddity, even make its way into Britain's chilly embrace. It begins, like so many strange colonial tales, with imperial ambition and shipping routes. Pineapples are native to South America, specifically Brazil and Paraguay. But by the 1600s, European explorers had begun transporting the seeds, and eventually the fruit itself, back to their homelands. The Dutch, Portuguese, and Spanish were especially enthusiastic, cultivating them in colonies from the Caribbean to Southeast Asia. But for the British, pineapples were trickier. The cold, damp British climate was wholly inhospitable to tropical plants. So the upper crust, obsessed with this king of fruit, invested absurd sums in elaborate greenhouses called pineries, structures engineered solely to nurture pineapples. These required heated flues, constant supervision, and more coal than a small village might burn in winter. It was, quite literally, fruit worship at industrial scale. And the Victorians? Oh, they adored a good agricultural challenge. It wasn't just about growing a pineapple. It was about conquering it, wrestling it into bloom through sheer engineering and social will. By the 1840s, pineapples grown in Britain were the stuff of legend. There were contests, newspaper reports. A pineapple debuting at a dinner party might be toasted like a newborn, or admired like a rare diamond. There's even a famous painting from the period titled The Pineapple Presenting Ceremony, in which a footman holds the fruit on a velvet cushion like a crown jewel. But if growing one was hard, importing them was harder. Only the wealthiest merchants could afford to ship pineapples from the Caribbean. The voyage was long, the fruit perishable, and the ships anything but climate-controlled. A pineapple that arrived intact was a triumph, one that cost, in today's money, several £100s. So to display it publicly, to carry it like a scepter, was not just eccentric, it was a declaration. Still, there were critics. Moralists fretted that the fruit had become too pagan in its associations. The sharp crown, the golden hue, too regal, too flamboyant. Some clergymen condemned the pineapple's rise to social stardom as a symptom of vanity and colonial excess. One London preacher, in a particularly dramatic sermon, referred to it as Eve's second fruit, the tempter of Victorian man. He didn't get invited to many parties after that. Historians still argue whether the pineapple's symbolism ever took on darker tones. There are a few suggestive lithographs, mostly French, depicting pineapples as stand-ins for decadence, or worse, for the unseemly blending of colonial subjects and British luxury. But in mainstream culture, the fruit's golden age remained oddly wholesome. A little silly, perhaps, but celebratory. By the mid-19th century, pineapple motifs were everywhere. Wallpaper, china, silverware, door knockers, hotels with pineapple-shaped spires, even gravestones carved with the fruit, perhaps as a final flex from beyond the veil. You glance around the room, now, spotting one on a mantelpiece in bronze. There's another, delicately embroidered on the hem of a lady's shawl. You wonder if anyone else here knows just how much it took to bring that symbol to life. But you do. You've read the horticultural manuals. The pages filled with absurdly specific instructions. How to angle the flue, when to mist the leaves, how to coax the plant with horse manure, and whispered encouragement. It was part science, part superstition, and entirely Victorian. Quirky fact. One gentleman in Kent allegedly played Mozart to his pineapple plants, believing it improved their morale. No notes on the results, but one hopes the pineapples appreciated the serenade. Meanwhile, pineapples began showing up in more public spectacles. At the Great Exhibition of 1851, the massive industrial showcase held at the Crystal Palace, pineapples featured prominently in the horticulture displays. Visitors oohed and ahed over them like foreign dignitaries. Some were placed under bell jars, others nested in ornate silver bowls. There's even mention of one pineapple being guarded by a footman, lest some enterprising guest attempt a sample. And you begin to see how, over time, the pineapple shifted from novelty to ritual. In elite households, a fresh pineapple was no longer consumed. It was passed from event to event, admired and sniffed, but never cut. It became heirloom fruit. There are accounts of pineapples that survived 5 or 6 parties before finally collapsing into mush. By then, their work was done. You look down at your own specimen now, still firm. A touch soft at the base, perhaps, but regal as ever. It's more than an accessory. It's a passport to attention, conversation, curiosity. You wonder how many times it's already been admired this week. Someone leans over, a stout man in a herringbone waistcoat, and whispers conspiratorially, "Imported or pinery grown?" You hesitate. Say nothing. Just smile. He nods knowingly. The pineapple mystery deepens. It's a game, after all. A performance. You're not just attending a party. You're playing a part in a fruit-fueled theatre of Victorian extravagance. And whether the pineapple is ironic, sincere, or something in between, it has you wrapped in its leafy little spell. Your gloved fingers trace the pineapple's textured skin as you wander deeper into the party's drawing room, each step echoing faintly against the parquet floors. Somewhere in the corner, someone is playing a sonatina on a faintly out-of-tune pianoforte. You drift, nodding politely, while the conversation floats past in a warm hum of syllables, phrenology, railway timetables, and the merits of boiled beef. Still, you find yourself wondering, why a pineapple? Why not a candelabra? Or an ivory fan? What made this particular fruit the ultimate social weapon? To understand that, you need to think like a Victorian gentleman. Not just a man of means, but one obsessed with signaling those means without ever seeming to do so. Enter the concept of conspicuous consumption, a term future economists would coin, but which every Victorian social climber instinctively understood. See, it wasn't enough to be rich. One had to display that wealth in maddeningly specific, socially acceptable ways. Owning art? Of course. Knowing Latin? Expected. But walking into a party with a pineapple tucked beneath your arm? That was a stroke of genius. It said, I have access. I have taste. I might even have a greenhouse staff. And all without uttering a word. By now, your pineapple's gotten you at least 4 unsolicited compliments. One elderly woman asks if she might have a sniff, which you oblige with great solemnity. Her face lights up either from genuine delight or from the heady perfume of fermented tropical sugar. There were other symbols, of course. Peacock feathers, Egyptian scarabs, voluminous neckties so complex they required a valet just to untie. But the pineapple had a unique advantage. It was rare, it was fragile, and it had an expiration date. That made it urgent. It's a bit like fashion, really. One couldn't wear last season's cravat and expect to be taken seriously. Similarly, a pineapple bruised or brown was a social misstep. And so, for gentlemen in the know, timing their fruit's debut became a strategic affair. One particularly ambitious host, Sir Reginald Fitzwilliam, minor baronet and major gossip, was known to keep 3 pineapples at different stages of ripeness, rotating them through appearances like an overworked theatre troupe. By the end of the season, they were borderline translucent, but his reputation remained untarnished. Still, there was a line between clever and crass. Some guests went too far, bringing not only pineapples, but entire fruit arrangements sculpted into swans or pyramids. One man famously hired an actor to play a pineapple butler, whose sole task was to carry the fruit on a silver tray and introduce it as His Excellency the Ananas Camosus. He was not invited back. Historians still debate whether that was satire or sincere overkill. Either way, it proves that Victorian society was deeply, almost comically invested in this edible status symbol. But pineapples didn't stay confined to the drawing room. As their popularity grew, they began infiltrating art, architecture, even literature. The pineapple became a shorthand for hospitality, refinement, and vaguely colonial charm. Carved pineapples appeared on bedposts and gate pillars. They adorned weather vanes, spires, and the crests of hotels, hoping to attract elite clientele. And curiously, pineapples began appearing in etiquette manuals. That's right. Books with titles like On Decorum, At Table and Tea featured entire sections about proper pineapple protocol. Should one slice it vertically or into rings? Must it always be presented whole, or could a carved half be deemed acceptable? Could a lady offer a pineapple to a gentleman, or was that too forward? You begin to see the fruit not just as an object, but as a character, one with its own set of social rules. Quirky tidbit: at least one etiquette guide from 1859 claimed that cutting a pineapple too hastily was a mark of vulgar impatience. Apparently, fruit etiquette required both precision and pacing. As the party continues, you overhear two gentlemen arguing, lightly of course, about the correct use of pineapple leaves in decorative wreaths. You glance at your own specimen. The crown's still intact, each pointy leaf casting a crisp shadow under the chandelier's glow. You catch your reflection in a mirror. Tall, well-postured, a faint smile playing at your lips. You look like someone who knows exactly where he belongs. And for tonight, at least, you do. The pineapple has done its job. Now comes the decision. Do you leave it somewhere conspicuous and pretend to forget it? A subtle invitation for admiration once you're gone? Or do you carry it home, allowing it to rest until the next salon, the next round of applause? Perhaps you cradle it in your lap, during the carriage ride back through the fog-draped streets, imagining the whispers of onlookers peering through frosted glass. Because in the end, it's not just fruit, it's theatre. And you, pineapple in hand, are both actor and audience in this delicious little production. Your carriage rocks gently as it moves through the gaslit streets, the city muffled beneath the fog. Your pineapple nestled beside you like a beloved lapdog. Inside your coat pocket is a crumpled dance card, mostly blank, but the fruit did more socializing than you did tonight. A success, all things considered. But now you're curious. How did something so odd become so enmeshed in the mechanics of the Victorian status games? Where did this fruity obsession start? Let's rewind way back. Pineapples didn't originate in greenhouses or gentlemen's clubs. They hail from South America, where indigenous peoples cultivated and revered them long before European explorers stumbled in and began assigning price tags to everything. The fruit first reached European shores in the late 15th or early 16th century, courtesy of those same explorers. It was sweet, exotic, bizarre-looking, perfectly novel for a continent still reeling from the bubonic plague and looking for distractions. Fast forward a few centuries, and the pineapple has become what today's marketers would call a luxury lifestyle symbol. In the 1600s and 1700s, pineapples were so rare and costly in Europe that people rented them by the day just to display at dinner parties. Yes, rented fruit. You'd pay a small fortune to place a single pineapple at the center of your table, letting it rot gloriously as guests fawned over it like a celebrity. Victorian England inherited this mania. But in true Victorian fashion, they added layers of ceremony, subtlety, and rigid rules. By the mid-1800s, pineapple cultivation had become something of a gentleman's sport. Wealthy landowners competed to grow them in specially designed pineries, greenhouses built for the sole purpose of pineapple cultivation. Some pineries even had underground heating systems fueled by coal or rotting manure, all to mimic the humid warmth of the tropics. One eccentric nobleman, Lord Madingley of Devonshire, kept a meticulous journal detailing his pineapple growing techniques, including precise humidity measurements and daily conversations with the fruit. "A happy plant yields a sweeter flesh," he wrote, with terrifying sincerity. Historians still argue whether pineapple growing was more about horticulture or ego. Probably both. But there's another layer to this story. The empire. The British Empire was, at this time, stretching its sticky fingers across the globe. And the pineapple, native to tropical regions, became a symbol of that reach. When you held one in your hand, you weren't just showcasing wealth, you were flaunting imperial dominance, albeit in a fruity disguise. It's hard to overstate just how visible the pineapple became. Victorian decorative arts are positively infested with them. door knockers shaped like pineapples, embroidered pineapple patterns on parlor cushions, even entire teapots in the shape of pineapples, which were deeply impractical and often leaked from the spout. Your pineapple, sitting now on a velvet footstool, looks rather smug. It knows it is more than just dessert. It's a cultural artifact, a colonial trophy, a piece of botanical theatre. And that performance played out in some curious ways. In certain upper-class households, pineapples were not eaten at all. Instead, they were passed from guest to guest, party to party, like a very perishable celebrity making the rounds. There's at least one recorded case of a pineapple that was seen at no fewer than 11 different dinner parties over 3 months, before finally collapsing in a mouldy heap and being buried, yes, buried, with a short eulogy. Another fringe example, a gentleman in Leeds had a series of portraits commissioned of himself holding the same pineapple in various heroic poses. A sort of tropical vanity project that today would probably be a series of Instagram selfies. You sip your imaginary Victorian tea and ponder this. Why were people so obsessed with a fruit they didn't even eat? The answer lies, at least partly, in fear. Social fear. The terror of being thought provincial, or worse, ordinary. In the hyper-stratified world of Victorian class structure, your belongings were your resume, and your fruit, strangely enough, was your cover letter. And if you didn't have a pineapple, you faked it. Some hosts use wax replicas, which could only fool the half-sighted and the very polite. Others carved pineapples out of wood and painted them painstakingly by hand. At least one enterprising hostess in Brighton is rumoured to have hollowed out a turnip and filled it with pineapple perfume. Desperate times. As you drift to sleep, or into another hypothetical party, you wonder what modern equivalent exists. Designer handbags? First editions? The ability to pronounce charcuterie without hesitation? Whatever it is, it likely doesn't smell as sweet. The next morning, you wake in your narrow Victorian bed, mosquito netting drawn, pineapple still perched reverently on your nightstand like a sleepy sentry. Sunlight creeps through lace curtains, and you begin to wonder what happens after the party ends. Where do pineapples go when they outlive their social utility? In Victorian England, the life cycle of a pineapple was surprisingly well documented, particularly among the upper classes, where everything had a paper trail, from servant misbehavior to fruit rot. The average display pineapple, if treated properly, kept cool, rotated to avoid bruising, and kept away from curious dogs, could last up to 2 weeks before becoming visually tragic. But the real aficionados didn't stop at display. No, they prolonged the pineapple's usefulness through a curious blend of ceremony and salvage. Some households maintained what they called a pineapple schedule, an actual list, usually managed by the butler, of upcoming social events and the expected ripeness of each pineapple in stock. Think of it like a Gantt chart, but stickier. One entry might read, Tuesday, Mrs. Everleigh's supper. Pineapple number 3, slightly bruised, side away from guests. And beneath that, Friday Vicar's luncheon. Pineapple number 3, with minor wax repairs. Once the pineapple's beauty faded beyond polite display, it moved into the second phase of its social utility, the cutting party. Now, this wasn't your average fruit bowl moment. The slicing of a pineapple was its own event. Guests gathered around murmuring in anticipation as a silver knife, often monogrammed, glided ceremonially into the amber flesh. Servants stood by with crystal dessert dishes. The host, naturally, perform the first slice, often with a small anecdote like, "This one came to maturity during the Derby." Historians still argue whether these cutting parties were true moments of indulgence or just performative frugality. Was the host being generous or merely showing that even a spoiled pineapple could have one last act? Either way, the cut pineapple was not something to gobble. Each sliver was savoured, chewed thoughtfully, with discussion of texture and acidity. Guests compared notes like wine critics. Hints of manure heat, one might say appreciatively. Yes, quite. A whisper of cucumber on the finish, another would nod. Even more curious were the afterlives of these sliced pineapples. In some circles, it was customary to preserve the rind, drying it gently, then placing it in linen sachets to perfume drawers or even closets. Others candied the peel or repurposed it into decorative centerpieces. There's even one record of a gentleman who commissioned a small coin purse made from the dried husk of his favorite pineapple, which is perhaps both touching and mildly terrifying. But the legacy didn't stop with the rind. If the fruit was exceptionally handsome in shape, some would commission a wax casting before slicing it. These wax pineapples were kept in parlours, dusted regularly, and displayed alongside busts of Roman emperors and dusty folios. A few particularly odd individuals are said to have named their wax pineapples, like family pets. "That's Horace," one might say casually. "He's seen 3 Christmases." You can't help but chuckle at the sheer effort this all entailed. Of course, pineapple ownership wasn't without pitfalls. As with any luxury item, theft was a real concern. In London alone, over 24 cases were brought to court in the mid-1800s involving the unlawful taking of pineapples. The theft of a pineapple could carry the same social weight as a stolen pocket watch. In one widely reported case, a housemaid was sentenced to 6 months hard labour for absconding with half a pineapple meant for a bishop's tea. The black market for pineapples, or pineapple lookalikes, thrived in the back alleys of port cities. Smugglers would sneak in bruised specimens from the Caribbean, sell them at a discount to eager hosts, and vanish into the fog. The more fashionable the season, the greater the risk of counterfeit fruit. One enterprising duo reportedly filled hollowed gourds with pineapple jelly to fake the shape and aroma, until one collapsed in a hostess's lap and caused quite a stir. This leads you to consider the absurdity of it all. How a piece of tropical produce became a stand-in for everything the Victorians loved. Status, order, theatricality, and just a dash of scandal. And as if that weren't enough, pineapples began showing up in fashion. Ladies sported pineapple brooches, hair combs shaped like the crown, and parasols embroidered with golden fruit motifs. One socialite, Lady Penelope Beardsley, famously attended Queen Victoria's Jubilee, wearing a dress covered entirely in tiny pineapple beads. It weighed 32 pounds and caused her to faint twice. But she was written up in the Times. So, success. You lean back, imagining your own Victorian wardrobe. Pineapple tie, perhaps. Pineapple cravat pin. It would have been an identity. A brand, even. You're not just a gentleman. You're a pineapple gentleman. The final quirk of the pineapple's role in society. It became a metaphor in courtship. To be called ripe for the picking wasn't necessarily a compliment, but being a well-kept pineapple suggested elegance and restrained desirability. Young men would sometimes gift illustrated pineapple calling cards, printed with their name and a subtle invitation to tea, inscribed beneath a sketch of the noble fruit. So tonight, as you lie there beside your metaphorical pineapple, drifting towards sleep. You're not just part of a historical reenactment. You're living proof that fruit and the people who love it can be deeply, wonderfully ridiculous. You're up now, figuratively at least, and slipping into your well-polished shoes for another outing. The pineapple once again tucked gently under your arm. But this evening isn't just any soiree. No, tonight you're attending what the Victorians called an at-home, a hybrid between a casual open house and a formal event. And yes, your pineapple has been carefully preened for the occasion, every waxy dimple buffed to a genteel shine. These at-homes were a staple of upper and middle-class Victorian life. Think of them as the Instagram stories of their era, temporary, performative, and designed to be subtly flaunting. Invitations were often issued in tiers. Friends and important acquaintances were invited from 4 to 6, the more elevated class from 6 to 8, and any potential suitors or influencers of the day. Ladies with literary reputations, for instance, from 8 until whenever decency gave out. At these affairs, pineapples didn't just sit silently on the table like edible topiary. They were placed on specially designed mirrored pedestals, surrounded by trimmed ivy or artificial violets, with little handwritten placards that might read, "On loan from Mr. Horace Winthrop, Esquire." In fact, pineapple rental was thriving by this point. Yes, you heard that right. Pineapple rental. If you were a bit strapped for cash but still wanted to appear fabulously connected, you could rent a pineapple by the day from certain entrepreneurial grocers. These gents would deliver a perfectly ripened fruit in the morning and collect it discreetly the next. Sometimes they'd even come mid-party to ensure the fruit hadn't been nibbled. "Strictly for looking," they'd warn with a finger wag. Historians still argue whether this practice emerged from necessity or sheer theatricality. Either way, by the late 1800s, entire pineapple lending libraries existed in major cities, their catalogues sorted by size, hue, and perceived prestige. One medium-ripe Antigua Gold, lightly bruised, ideal for candlelit suppers. Now imagine walking into one of these parties. You present your card to the butler, who glances only briefly before admiring the fruit under your arm, and step into a room filled with chatter, chamber music, and the clinking of teacups. Dozens of pineapples dot the parlor like trophies, each one vying for attention. And suddenly, you realize this is a competition, and your pineapple? It had better perform. Victorians loved to appraise each other's fruit, in the same way we might silently rank wedding outfits or bookshelf aesthetics. A pineapple with slightly green flanks? Clearly new money. One too ripe? Poor planning. One in a brass cradle shaped like cherubs lifting it to heaven? Perhaps trying too hard. You sidle over to the tea station, served lukewarm with a lemon twist, and overhear two ladies whispering about a pineapple so symmetrical it made Lady Farnsworth weep. You glance down at yours, subtly repositioning it for maximum crown visibility. But tonight's party has a twist. This hostess has decided to host a pineapple auction, a parlor game where guests bid imaginary currency on each fruit based on its aesthetics, origin, and aroma. The prize: bragging rights and a paper ribbon that reads, "Most discerning guest." You play along, offering 17 guineas for a golden-skinned beauty from the West Indies. But secretly, you're eyeing the competition. That man near the fireplace with the plaid waistcoat. He's got a fruit so perfectly sun-kissed, you suspect he bribed the grocer. And that woman with the feathered fan? She's pretending not to care, but she's angled her pineapple toward the window for optimal gleam. Even in jest, the game is serious business. Victorians loved competition wrapped in decorum. You win nothing but a smile and a clever comment, but in this world, that's currency enough. Now, as the evening winds down and candle wax puddles across the silver candelabras, the hostess offers one last amuse-bouche, a thimble of chilled pineapple cordial, said to be from a real fruit, not just pineapple essence. Everyone sighs, savoring the mild sweetness, and you suddenly realize, after all this fuss, you've yet to actually taste your pineapple. And maybe that's the point. To own a pineapple in Victorian England wasn't necessarily about consumption. It was about perception. It was about optics and grace, and being seen to possess what others could only dream of, even if just for a borrowed evening. By now, your arm aches slightly from holding the fruit just so, your back stiff from all the posturing. But your reputation? Intact, perhaps even elevated. As the guests file out and the room begins its slow transformation back into a sitting room of pillows and chamber pots, you tip your hat to the hostess, give your pineapple one last appreciative nod, and make your exit. Outside, a light drizzle falls. Classic London. You raise your coat collar, cradle the fruit protectively, and begin the walk home, leaving behind flickering gas lamps and the laughter of the elite. Somewhere behind you, someone sneezes delicately into a lace handkerchief. You don't look back. You're already planning your next appearance, perhaps at the botanical lecture next Tuesday. There, among the ferns and fusty professors, your pineapple might draw the gaze of a particularly bookish admirer. Or maybe not. Maybe you'll just polish it up, give it a little name like Clarence, and let it rest on your mantle for a few more days. After all, you've grown attached. You're back home now, slipping out of your coat, pineapple cradled like an infant in your arms. It gets pride of place on the mantle naturally. The room's chill doesn't touch you. Tonight's party was a success, and your fruit was admired by at least 3 people, one of whom probably wasn't just being polite. But as the fire crackles and your house slippers sigh beneath your feet, a question hovers just out of reach. How did it come to this? Why did Victorian society pour so much status into a single spiky fruit? To understand, you need to peek beyond the drawing rooms and into the deep roots of imperial obsession and exoticism. The Victorians, like many before and after them, were absolutely smitten with the foreign. But not just any foreign, specifically the curated version of the tropics, bright parrots, mahogany furniture, and yes, pineapples. By the mid-1800s, Britain's global trade networks were vast and extractive. Sugar, tea, spices, rubber, anything that could be cultivated, shipped, and taxed became not just a commodity, but a marker of civilization's supposed progress. Pineapples native to South America and cultivated across the Caribbean were caught in this same net of colonial desire. You see, pineapples represented more than wealth. They represented reach. They hinted quietly that you or someone in your family tree had connections abroad, perhaps even a relative posted in Barbados or Jamaica. It was a way of saying, yes, my influence spans oceans, without having to say a word. And as any seasoned social climber knows, subtlety is half the game. What makes this more fascinating is the way pineapples began appearing in art. They show up in the backgrounds of oil portraits, tucked beside a velvet curtain or nestled in a silver bowl. They're carved into stone facades of country manors, woven into tapestries, and sculpted into urns. There's even an entire pineapple-shaped folly in Scotland. Yes, really, commissioned by a lord who believed the fruit symbolized hospitality, though historians still argue whether it was a serious tribute or just aristocratic whimsy gone haywire. But back to you and your pineapple. It isn't just decoration, it's symbol. It speaks for you at parties, when words would be too gauche. And more importantly, it behaves. Unlike an unruly cousin or a wayward dinner guest, your pineapple says precisely what you want it to. This person, they have taste. Now imagine, if you will, the length people went to keep their pineapples pristine. Special cloches of glass were crafted to preserve them, polished daily and stored away from sunlight like relics. Some households even kept decoy pineapples made of papier-mâché or wax, just in case their real one turned before the next gathering. Nothing more awkward than displaying a pineapple with a brown patch. You may as well wear last season's gloves. Of course, not everyone bought into the trend. Some writers of the day poked fun at the whole affair. Satirical cartoons depicted overripe pineapples with monocles and waistcoats, lounging like minor dukes. One scathing pamphlet even accused the pineapple craze of sapping the national character. A slightly dramatic way of saying that maybe, just maybe, people were getting a bit too fruity with their priorities. But the obsession endured. Cookbooks from the time include elaborate pineapple centerpieces made not to eat, but to behold. These weren't salads. These were spectacles. Cored fruits filled with wine jelly, then reassembled and dusted with sugar, or lined with candied violets and balanced atop miniature Corinthian columns. Fruit sculpture, they called it. You pause now looking over at your own pineapple, its waxy skin catching the firelight. You wonder what it would say about you if it could speak. That you're aspirational, eccentric, or simply that you appreciate a good visual pun. No matter. You're in good company. Napoleon himself reportedly received pineapples as tribute. And Queen Victoria? She had an entire greenhouse dedicated to them, though it's still debated whether she ever actually enjoyed the taste. Because here's the twist. Victorian pineapples didn't taste very good. Not always. Not after weeks in transit. Many arrived underripe or spoiled. But no one complained because the flavor was never really the point. You didn't eat a pineapple. You displayed it until it collapsed in on itself from sheer neglect. Only then might it be cut, stewed into a cordial, or tossed into a bin, while its legacy endured in memory. It's a bit like the modern wedding cake that's mostly styrofoam for show. You smile, nod, photograph it, and move on. So there you are, caught between affection and absurdity, standing in your sitting room, wondering how a colonial fruit became your wingman. But the truth is, the pineapple's story is also your story. A tale of image, aspiration, and gentle one-upmanship, wrapped in a leafy crown. And as the clock chimes softly in the hall, you run a finger down the fruit's spine and think, maybe tomorrow you'll rent a second one, just to see how the neighbors react. Morning light slips through your lace curtains as you rise, just a little groggy but victorious. Your pineapple stands sentinel on the mantel, still smug, still flawless. It hasn't collapsed overnight, a good omen. Now, as you dress, starched collar, crisp cravat, boots buffed to an almost ridiculous shine, you're already planning the next move. The social season isn't over yet. And let's be honest, tonight's event isn't really about the company or the music or even the Madeira. It's about visibility. It's about placement. Where does your pineapple go this time? The center of the table is classic, of course. But what about the sideboard, just beside the oyster tray? Or perched jauntily at the edge of the punch bowl like some citrus sentinel? The options are endless and entirely ridiculous. But so was most of Victorian etiquette. You step outside into the gentle smog and clatter of your neighborhood. Horses clopping, carriages groaning, the street urchin from across the way, already selling yesterday's news for a penny. And you wonder, does anyone else here know that pineapples were once rented by the hour? Because yes, that's where we are now in the tale. Renting. See, at the absolute height of the pineapple craze, the demand became so overwhelming that enterprising merchants devised a clever solution. Since not everyone could afford to own a pineapple, they could now borrow one. For a fee, of course. It worked like this. You'd contact your local fruitmonger, agree on a price, perhaps 5 or 6 shillings depending on ripeness, and receive a beautiful pineapple, fresh enough to display for a dinner party, stiff enough to last the evening. Afterward, it was returned lightly spritzed and rented out to the next hopeful host. Like a very expensive edible library book. Some pineapples, if lucky, made appearances at multiple events across several weeks. A well-traveled fruit might attend 5 soirees before finally being sliced open and served at a merchant's luncheon, thus retiring in style. It's still debated whether the general public caught on to this system, or if most people genuinely believed each pineapple was a fresh, personal acquisition. Historians still argue whether this practice was widely accepted or quietly ridiculed behind closed doors. Now imagine being a guest, craning your neck to admire the centerpiece and whispering to your companion, "I swear I saw that same pineapple at Lady Bellingham's cotillion last Thursday." And your companion nods, eyebrows raised, lips pursed. The scandal, the economy, the impropriety of it all. But perhaps the most amusing part, people pretended they didn't notice, because calling it out meant risking your own social veneer. After all, what if you were caught renting next week? So the illusion was preserved. Everyone played along. This elaborate game of edible appearances even trickled down into the working classes, albeit in a more whimsical form. Confectioners began crafting pineapple-shaped jellies and cakes, cheaper replicas for those without aristocratic connections. Some hat makers even experimented with pineapple-inspired designs, crowned brims, spiked embellishments. Suddenly, the fruit was no longer just a fruit. It was a motif. And as you walk past shop windows now, you begin to notice them everywhere. On porcelain, on embossed wallpaper, on the hilt of a cane. It's almost like the pineapples are watching you back. Of course, beneath all this visual delight lies a less sparkly truth. The pineapple boom was only possible because of British imperialism, its plantations, its forced labor, and its aggressive trade policies. Behind every glossy rind was a vast network of ships, tariffs, and exploited workers whose stories rarely made it into the drawing rooms of polite society. You think about that as you pass the grocer's window, where an imported pineapple sits behind a velvet rope like some tropical prisoner on display. There's irony here, you know. This prized fruit, so symbolic of hospitality and welcome, was part of an economy that didn't exactly welcome everyone. And yet, somehow, no one seems to notice. Or they choose not to. But back to you and your social calendar. Tonight's event is a charity auction, a perfect place for pineapple theatre. You decide on a whim to arrive early and help with setup. There, beneath the flickering gaslights and the half-unfolded linen tablecloths, you carefully position your fruit atop a stack of botanical encyclopedias. The symbolism is a bit on the nose, but it works. Knowledge, refinement, juicy ambition. By the time the guests arrive, your centerpiece is already drawing murmurs. Someone even jokes about installing a spotlight. You beam quietly, sip your tea, and resist the urge to correct them on the pineapple's genus, Ananas commosus if you're curious. Later that night, as the hall empties and the footmen begin clearing trays, you linger just a moment longer beside your fruit. It's still intact, still gleaming. You wonder, as the music fades, how many more nights it has left. 2? 3? Perhaps it's time to let this one go. You carry it home like a trophy, head held high. Tomorrow, maybe you'll finally eat it. Or maybe not. It's the next morning and your pineapple sits on the breakfast table, awkwardly positioned between a half-read newspaper and a pot of marmalade. You stare at it. It stares back. And despite the previous evening's triumph, a peculiar thought tickles your mind. Why do we even associate pineapples with hospitality in the first place? That idea, the pineapple as a symbol of welcome, has burrowed itself deep into architecture, etiquette, and yes, even guest napkins. But few people in your circle could tell you where it began. The origins trace back long before your Victorian streets were cobbled to the 17th century, when European explorers first returned from the Americas, cradling these strange, spiny fruits. Native to South America, pineapples were already well regarded by indigenous communities. When Europeans laid eyes on them, the reaction was somewhere between fascination and obsession. To the early colonists and sailors, pineapples became a sort of golden trophy, a sign you'd made the dangerous voyage and returned with something exotic, something rare, because transporting them intact over the Atlantic. No easy feat, you had to get the timing right. One wrong wave, one too hot deck, and the whole fruit turned to mush. And so, when a ship docked and a pineapple appeared at a captain's table, it sent a clear message. I've traveled. I've survived, and now I'm generous enough to share. This tradition filtered into English culture. Households that could afford to acquire, or more likely rent, a pineapple would place it prominently in the entrance hall or dining area, a quiet but pointed declaration of both wealth and warmth. Welcome, it whispered, but also, yes, I'm richer than you. By your day, the Victorian era, this symbolism had only grown stickier. Pineapples had worked their way into wood carvings, silver finials, and embroidered chairbacks. Walk past the grandest homes in Bath or Brighton, and you might spot a pineapple perched atop a gatepost or weather vane, casting judgment like a fruity gargoyle. Yet there was always a bit of a joke in it too. A wink. Everyone knew it was all just a little too much. And that's the part you appreciate most. This strange prickly fruit, equal parts snack and status symbol, carried a subtle ridiculousness that society somehow missed. Or maybe they saw it and didn't care. Either way, the pineapple had become the perfect social performance prop, equal parts serious and silly, desirable and disposable. As you sip your tea, you recall one particularly memorable example, a true tale that rippled through Victorian drawing rooms like gossip down a clothesline. A well-to-do London family had rented a pineapple for their daughter's coming-of-age ball. It was set in the foyer on a marble pedestal, draped in satin and illuminated by a chandelier overhead. Guests were to admire it upon arrival, nod solemnly, and continued toward the dancing. But the family's footman, a new hire with more enthusiasm than sense, decided to refresh the display before guests arrived. He dabbed a bit of oil on the pineapple skin to make it glisten. Unfortunately, the oil wasn't culinary. It was lamp oil. The result? A room that reeked of kerosene and fruit salad. The pineapple, now dangerously flammable and slightly wilted, was quietly removed midway through the evening, replaced with a porcelain vase, and a note claiming it had been overripe. The guests? None the wiser, or at least polite enough to pretend. You chuckle softly, imagining the frantic scrambling behind closed doors. Another Victorian social fire narrowly avoided, this one almost literal. But if there's one thing your experience with pineapples has taught you, it's that most of society's rituals are just this: well-rehearsed illusions, expensive fruit, borrowed prestige, elaborate stories to prop up simpler truths. Still, it's all kind of beautiful in its own absurd way. After breakfast, you wander to your writing desk and begin composing a letter to your cousin in Bath. They've been struggling to make an impression this season. Perhaps it's time to send the pineapple on a short holiday. Let it work its magic at a different party. Or better yet, maybe you'll loan it to the museum down the street. They're curating a display on objects of the empire. And surely no object speaks more to Britain's peculiar blend of trade, status and pageantry than this tropical crown of contradictions. As you fold the letter and stamp the wax, the pineapple glints in the corner of your eye. You know it's ridiculous, but you still kind of love it. Days pass. The pineapple has become part of the furniture now. Less a fruit, more a house guest. Perched on a crystal pedestal in your sitting room, it exudes an air of weary superiority. Visitors glance at it with arched brows. The butler, silently resentful of its presence, dusts it daily with a reverence usually reserved for porcelain saints. But you, well, you've been pondering something more abstract. What does it mean to own something so obviously meant for display? And perhaps more curiously, why does everyone pretend that's not the whole point? You're not alone in these musings. Throughout the Victorian period, your fellow gentlemen were constantly seeking new ways to signal taste and refinement. Pineapples were only one part of the larger theatre of conspicuous consumption. There were Egyptian revival clocks, taxidermy birds under glass, Persian carpets flung over upright pianos. And then, of course, there were the cabinets. Oh, the cabinets. Every self-respecting gentleman kept a cabinet of curiosities, a sort of micro-museum meant to astonish and confuse guests in equal measure. Inside might be a beesore stone, a shard of Pompeii, a desiccated pufferfish, or a magnifying glass with questionable provenance, Napoleon's possibly. The pineapple, when not actively attending a party, might rest beside these oddities, revered not for its taste, but for its aura of global adventure. Historians still argue whether this obsession with a spectacle was rooted in genuine scientific curiosity or sheer competitive display. Probably both. But what's certain is that Victorian material culture revolved around one simple principle: appearances matter. Even your clothing echoes this, layers upon layers. Cravats folded into improbable shapes, cuffs, brooches, walking sticks, every detail calculated. You once spent nearly half an hour choosing between 2 shades of ivory gloves. Not because anyone would comment, but precisely because they wouldn't. That's how one wins. And here lies the most curious contradiction. For all the stiff upper lips and rigid etiquette, Victorian society was remarkably performative. underneath the starched collars and moralistic sermons was a thriving world of winks, nods, and social sleight of hand. Which brings you to the pineapple once more. A neighbour stops by, Lady Rathbone, with her plumed bonnet and a nose like a chisel. She takes one look at the pineapple and pauses. "Oh," she says lightly, "how exotic." You can feel the calculation happening behind her spectacles. She's estimating your social rise, weighing your connections, wondering whether this pineapple was purchased outright or, heaven forbid, rented. So you smile. "A gift from the governor of Mauritius," you lie sipping your tea. "Arrived by steam packet just last week." Lady Rathbone's eyebrows lift a full half-inch. Success. As she departs, murmuring something about colonial excellence, you lean back and reflect on your small deception. In truth, the pineapple was sourced from a Covent Garden vendor who offered it at half price due to a slight bruise near the base. But that detail, while factual, is entirely irrelevant. Because Victorian society isn't about truth, it's about performance. Truth is optional. Spectacle is mandatory. Even the language dances around this fact. You don't buy something vulgar, you procure it. A man doesn't sweat, he perspires gently. And heaven forbid you should admit to napping. You were resting one's eyes in repose. Of course, beneath all this pageantry lies something rather sweet. An earnest, if theatrical, desire to connect. Every object, every flourish, every pineapple is a small cry for attention, admiration, or just maybe, affection. And you, despite your dry wit and impeccable waistcoat, are not immune to this. Later that evening, you do something rather uncharacteristic. You peel the pineapple. It takes effort. The spines bite your fingers. The juice leaks onto your mahogany table. You wrestle with it like a man unaccustomed to manual labor, which, to be fair, you are. And then you take a bite. It's sharp, tangy, a little overripe at the edges, but undeniably delicious. You laugh aloud, more from surprise than delight. This fruit, once merely a social totem, is suddenly something else entirely. A reminder that even the most pretentious symbols can have substance. In that moment, the pineapple becomes yours, not as a prop, but as a snack. The next morning, your butler discovers the fruit reduced to a sticky rind and stares at you with something close to betrayal. But you just shrug. "Better eaten than dusted," you say. And for the first time in weeks, your sitting room smells not of polish or sandalwood, but of pineapple. You wake to sunlight streaming through the curtains, the sweet sour scent of pineapple still lingering faintly in the air. The rind is gone now, tucked away by a baffled housemaid who doesn't know whether to preserve it or compost it. You, meanwhile, stretch luxuriously beneath your quilt, arms wide, as if you've shed not just a fruit, but a whole layer of social choreography. There's something liberating about the aftermath. No more polishing. No more anxious glances at the crown to check for browning. Just use and the memory of a fruit that once made you feel oddly powerful. You dress slowly today. Less fuss. No need for the double-layered cravat. No waistcoat pin. You even let your cuffs go slightly wrinkled. Let them talk. You've eaten the pineapple. You've won the game. There's a kind of quiet peace that comes from participating fully in the theatre of status and then stepping off the stage. Outside, the street hums with the usual churn of carriages, flower sellers, and distant hooves. You sip your tea by the window, watching the world tilt forward, and you can't help but feel a touch nostalgic. The pineapple craze, you sense, it's beginning to fade. It happens subtly, One year, there's a pineapple on every table. The next, there's talk of oranges, of Persian melons, of candied violets. Tastes change as they always do. Symbols rot faster than the fruit they rest on. There's even a satire published recently, the pomological farce, in which a group of social climbers fight over a pineapple only to discover it's a turnip painted gold. You read it twice, smirking each time. Historians still argue when exactly the pineapple lost its power. Some blame the increase in trade. As ships got faster and refrigerated transport became possible, the pineapple became more accessible, more ordinary. Others say it simply became too common, a victim of its own popularity. What was once an exotic crown now sits unceremoniously in grocers' windows next to the cabbage. That's the thing about status symbols. They only work if they're exclusive. Once everyone has one, no one wants one. And so, like all social currency, the pineapple is quietly retired from the ballroom. The pedestals vanish, the mirrored trays are packed away. The rented specimens return to their shops, their golden sheen no longer special, just sticky. But even as the fad fades, the legacy lingers. Walk through a Victorian seaside hotel, and you'll still spot pineapple finials on the stair banisters. Visit an old manor house, and chances are there's a pineapple on the gate, greeting guests with imperial charm. The fruit has left the table, but it's still in the architecture, still in the metaphors, still in the stories, whispered by silver-haired aunts at garden parties. And you, dear pineapple veteran, are one of the last of your kind. You're invited to a party next week. The invitation is scented and gilt-edged. You're expected, as always, to arrive in style. And while the thought crosses your mind, just briefly, to take along another pineapple, you don't. Instead, you take a bottle of cordial, made from that same fruit. A quiet nod, a subtle toast. At the gathering, people notice, they comment. "Ah, pineapple," they say, half smiling. "How very retro." But their eyes twinkle, because they remember too. You take your seat, pour a thimbleful of syrup into your teacup, and raise it ever so slightly in salute, to fruit, to fashion, and to the absurd beauty of trying to impress people with edible ornaments. It's a closing act, but also maybe a new one. And now, let it all fade. Let the echo of waltzes and rustling silk dissolve into softness. The pineapple has been eaten, the ballroom emptied, the candlelight flickered into memory. There's nothing left to display, no guests to impress, no fruit to polish or position just so. Just quiet. You rest your head imagining the weight of a pineapple gently cradled in your arms. No longer a burden, just something warm and familiar, something that smells faintly of sugar and far-off lands. Inhale. Exhale. You're no longer in Victorian England. You're not in any ballroom. You're floating, somewhere between now and then, between laughter and lull. You've walked through history, through satire and spectacle, through fruit, laced ambition and well-mannered nonsense. You've seen the pineapple at its finest. And now, you rest. Let your thoughts drift like candle smoke. Let your limbs go soft as parchment. Let the night carry you, gently, into a dream where status is silly, and pineapples are always perfectly ripe. Close your eyes. Sleep well.